What do you do when you're 16 years old and your stepfather tells you to pack your things because on Saturday you won't live there anymore? You'd think there'd be a script for that. A right way to feel, a right way to react. There isn't. There's just numbness, and a suitcase, and a clock that won't stop ticking. My name is Tamira Warner, and this is the story of how I lost everything at 16 and how I built it all back, brick by brick, job by job, degree by degree, while the man who threw me out watched from a distance, certain I would fail. He was wrong. But it took me years to understand exactly how wrong and exactly how hard he'd worked to make sure I wouldn't prove it. My mother's name was Carol. She was 17 when she had me, and she spent the rest of her life paying interest on that early start. Minimum wage jobs, apartments with thin walls, a car that broke down at the worst possible moments. She tried community college once, made it 2 semesters before the transmission gave out and the tuition money became repair money instead. She never went back to complete her education, but she never stopped believing in school. Not for herself, she'd made peace with that door closing, but for me. "You're going to walk across a stage in a cap and gown, Tamira," she used to say, like it was already written somewhere, and she was just reading it out loud to remind me. "Doesn't matter what else happens, you do that." She married Jake when I was 10. I won't pretend I ever warmed to him, but I understood why she did. He had a steady job, a paid-off truck, a house that didn't smell like other people's cigarette smoke through the walls. After a decade of struggle, stability probably felt like love. I think, if I'm honest, she never loved him the way she should have. But she stayed, because staying was safer than starting over again. Then, a year before my 16th birthday, my mother's heart stopped. Just like that. She had a condition none of us knew about. The muscle of her heart had been quietly thickening for years, choking its own chambers, until one afternoon it simply gave out. Sudden cardiac arrest, the doctor said, like those 3 words could hold the size of what had just happened. I didn't get a goodbye. I got a phone call and then a funeral home that did the whole thing on the cheapest package available. I didn't care about the cheap casket or the folding chairs. I knew where she was. That was enough for me. What I didn't know was that her death had also removed the only thing standing between Jake and the rest of his plan. Grief does strange things to people, and for the first few months after Mom died, I told myself, that's all this was. Jake going quiet, Jake skipping dinner, Jake barely looking at me when he came home. I told myself he was drowning, same as I was, just drowning differently. Then, about 3 months in, he sat me down and told me it was time I started contributing to the household. I was 15. I couldn't legally work full hours. What he meant, it turned out, was a chore schedule taped to the refrigerator with my name at the top of every single line. Laundry, dishes, vacuuming, scrubbing the bathroom grout with an old toothbrush on Sundays. I did it all without complaint, because some small, hopeful part of me thought if I could just be useful enough, quiet enough, easy enough, he'd let me stay. As my birthday got closer, the temperature in that house dropped fast. A spoon left in the sink overnight became a 15-minute lecture. A Sunday laundry load pushed to Monday because I had a social studies presentation became proof in his eyes that I didn't respect him. Small things a functioning adult wouldn't blink at, but he was building a case, brick by brick, and I didn't understand yet what the case was for. A week before I turned 16, he blew up over something I don't even remember anymore, and in the middle of it, he said the thing he'd apparently been waiting a year to say. "You better start packing, girl. Saturday, you're on your own. You're not staying here anymore." He didn't yell it. That's the part I remember most clearly. He said it in that flat, controlled voice, the same voice he used to use on my mother right before she'd go quiet for the rest of the night. I knew in that moment he wasn't bluffing. There was no smile on his face. There was nothing on his face at all. I found out much later, though I'd always wonder about the timing, that age 16 wasn't a random number to him. He'd done his research. 16 was the age courts generally treated as the practical floor for a minor to be considered capable of surviving on her own, the age nobody was likely to come knocking on his door asking hard questions about me, about my education, about where I was living. He wasn't reckless. He was careful. He wanted me gone, and he wanted to be able to say, if anyone ever asked, that he hadn't done anything wrong. I had 6 days. I don't remember much of what happened in the hours right after he said it. I went into some kind of autopilot, the kind where your body keeps functioning long after your mind has checked out. I remember standing in my room, looking at everything I owned, trying to figure out what fit in one suitcase and what didn't matter anymore. School was still in session, a month left before summer. I didn't have a plan, I didn't have money, and I didn't have anyone who was legally obligated to take me in. What I had was a phone full of numbers I started calling, trying to reach out to anyone who could help me, if only for a little while. A woman from our church, someone my mother used to sit with every Sunday, told me she'd pray on it and never called back. Another family, people who'd brought a casserole to my mother's funeral, who'd hugged me and told me to call if I needed anything, suddenly had a lot going on right now. I didn't understand it then. I chalked it up to people being people, uncomfortable with a homeless teenager showing up on their doorstep. It would be years before I learned Jake had gotten to them first, quietly, in the way a deacon can get to people. A concerned word here, a suggestion there, planting the idea that I was more trouble than I let on. So I couch surfed. A night with a school friend whose mom didn't ask too many questions. A few nights with a girl from my chemistry class. I kept my grades up through all of it because it was the one thing that still felt like it belonged to me. The night after the last day of school, I had nowhere left to go. I ended up at Vista View Park, the only park in this part of South Florida with any real hills to it, and only because the whole thing was built on top of an old landfill. There was a bathroom I could wash up in and a stretch of ground tucked behind some trees where I figured no one would notice me. I laid out on the grass that night, 1 month past my 16th birthday, and looked up at a sky that didn't care what happened to me, and I made myself a promise. I didn't know yet that there were programs for kids like me, emergency shelters, foster placements for teens, caseworkers whose whole job was exactly this situation. Nobody had told me, and in survival mode, you don't have the bandwidth to go looking. All I knew was, find a place to sleep, do the homework, find a shower, repeat. That was the whole plan, for a while. That summer I got to stay for a month with a distant cousin of my mother's, a small bedroom and a number attached to it. 1 month, and rent from day one. It wasn't generosity so much as a business arrangement, but it was a roof, and a roof was a start. I decided a car was the answer. Not a nice one. Just something with 4 wheels and a working engine, because a car meant I could stop being at the mercy of other people's guest rooms. A car meant a locked door. A car meant I could keep my things in one place instead of shuffling them between other people's closets. So I worked. McDonald's first. "You're 3 minutes late, Tamira." My manager didn't even look up from the register when he said it. 3 minutes. I'd been walking 2 miles because the bus that used to get me there on time had changed its schedule that week, and I hadn't found out until I was already standing at the empty stop. "I'm sorry, I'll make up the time at the end of my—" "We've talked about this before." He hadn't. Not really. Not in any way that matched what came next. "I think this isn't working out." I didn't fight it. I didn't have the energy to fight it. I found out much later, from someone who used to work the same shifts, that my manager sat 2 pews over from Jake every Sunday, and that Jake had made it a habit of mentioning, casually in the way of concerned church small talk, that his stepdaughter wasn't the most reliable, and that he hoped she wouldn't cause any trouble wherever she landed. At the time, I just thought I'd had bad luck. 3 minutes, and I was out. I picked myself back up. Dollar store, dog walking for 2 families in my old neighborhood, weekend babysitting for a couple who never asked why a 16-year-old needed the cash so badly. I took on every job that I could. By the end of that summer, I had $3,000 saved, and I used almost every cent of it on a car that had more rust than paint, but ran every single morning without fail. I named it nothing. I just called it mine. A car solved one problem and revealed another. You can sleep in a car, but you might not be able to live a life out of one, not for long. I heard about a house-sitting platform that sounded promising until I found the fine print. Minimum age 21. Another one, the minimum age was 18. I was 16. Both doors closed before I'd even reached for the handle. Then, almost by accident, I found out there was farmland tucked inside South Miami, actual rural acreage 20 minutes from where I used to live, that I hadn't even known existed. The farmer who owned one of the farms, an older man who asked fewer questions than anyone else I'd met that year, let me park my car on his property for $300 a month. He had a warehouse with a working shower and 2 farmhands who lived in RVs at the edge of the field. It wasn't a home, but it was a place with a lock on the bathroom door and people who looked out for me without expecting anything strange in return. And after the year I'd had, that felt like enormous luck. That farm gave me something I hadn't had since my mother died. Stability long enough to breathe and to plan past the next 24 hours. The farmer's name was Mr. Garcia, and he never once asked me why a 16-year-old was parking a rusted-out car on his land instead of living in a house somewhere with an actual family. I used to wonder if he already knew the answer and simply didn't need to hear it out loud. Some mornings he'd leave a bag of tomatoes or a few eggs on my windshield without a word and drive off toward the far field before I could even say thank you. It wasn't charity exactly. I still paid my $300 on the first of every month, same as the 2 farmhands in their RVs, but it was the first time in over a year that an adult had looked at me and simply let me be a kid trying to survive, without an angle, without a schedule taped to a refrigerator. I kept a routine that whole first year, up before 6 to shower in the warehouse while it was still empty. Homework at a card table one of the farmhands, a quiet man named Reuben, had dragged out of his RV for me without being asked. Work in the afternoons, whatever work I could find. Back to the car by dark, doors locked, a flashlight under the passenger seat in case I needed to read after the farm's one outdoor bulb clicked off. It wasn't a childhood, but it was mine, and nobody could take it away from me on a week's notice. I'm not going to pretend that year, or the years right after it, were anything but hard. Things happened to me that summer, and the summer after that I don't tell most people about. But they're not the point of this story. The point of this story is that I made it. I got my GED, then community college, then eventually a 4-year degree. 2 things kept me moving forward on nights when moving forward felt impossible. The first was my mother. She never got the chance to walk across a graduation stage, and I decided somewhere along the way that I would do it for both of us. That every accomplishment I earned would be proof that the story didn't have to end where hers had. I could go to school when she couldn't. I could build a life without marrying my way into stability, without settling the way she'd had to settle. The second thing, and I'm not proud of this one, was Jake. He'd wanted me to fail. My success, I understood clearly, would be more than an accomplishment. It would be an indictment, a living, breathing rebuttal to every story he'd probably told himself and everyone else about why he had to let me go. I wanted him to have to watch it happen. I wanted him to sit in his pew on Sunday, deacon's face on, and know exactly what he'd tried to bury. Because here's the thing I couldn't get past, no matter how many years passed. If I'd been a runaway, if I'd been on drugs, if I'd given him one real reason, maybe I could have understood it, even hated it a little less. But I hadn't been any of those things. I'd been a good kid who did her chores and kept her grades up and never once talked back. He simply hadn't wanted me in his house anymore, and he'd built himself a legal, tidy, deacon-shaped alibi to make sure nobody could ever call it what it was. I started noticing patterns, even back then, though I didn't have the full picture yet. It struck me as strange that not one single person from our church had room for a grieving 16-year-old, when half of them had cried at my mother's funeral. It struck me as strange that I'd been fired over 3 minutes when I'd watched other employees stroll in 15-20 minutes late without so much as a raised eyebrow. Strange things, scattered across years, that I filed away without connecting. The third time it happened, I finally understood there was a pattern, but that part of the story comes later. When it came time to pick a major, I wasn't chasing passion. I was chasing stability, as fast and as directly as I could get to it. I sat down with a guidance counselor who laid it out plainly. Business degree, strong grades, a good first offer, learn everything you can on the job, then go back for an MBA and climb. It wasn't romantic advice, it was exactly what I needed. In my junior year, I had a professor, Dr. Alvarez, who taught a statistics course I'd signed up for almost by accident, needing to fill a schedule gap. 3 weeks in, she kept me after class and told me, flatly, that I had a facility with numbers most of her students spent a whole semester trying to fake. She became the first adult in years who saw something in me and said so out loud, without an agenda attached to it. She's the reason I ended up specializing in business analysis instead of general management, the reason I learned to read a spreadsheet the way other people read a room. I worked through every single semester. Not because I had to prove anything to anyone in those classrooms, but because the version of me who'd slept in a park behind the bushes never fully believed a paycheck would keep coming unless I earned it myself, over and over with my own 2 hands. I was never without a job again after that first year on the farm. I was never, ever without savings again either. There was a stretch in my senior year of undergrad when the money got tight again, an old fear that never fully left me no matter how much I'd saved. I took on a part-time analyst internship at a mid-sized logistics company that fall, mostly to keep the bank account from dipping below the number that let me sleep at night. My supervisor there, a woman named Lauren, was the one who first showed me that the same brain that used to calculate how many babysitting hours I needed to cover a tank of gas could just as easily model freight costs across a distribution network. "You already think this way," she told me one afternoon, looking over a spreadsheet I'd cleaned up without being asked. "Most people have to be taught to think in numbers under pressure. You just already do." I didn't tell her why. Some things you keep for yourself. The day I got my MBA, I stood in a cap and gown in a stadium full of strangers' families, and for one long moment, I let myself imagine my mother in the crowd, exactly where she'd always said she'd be. She wasn't there, but I was standing exactly where she'd told me I would be all those years ago, like she'd already read it somewhere. I framed the diploma myself in a $5 frame from the same dollar store I used to work at and hung it directly across from my bed so it would be the first thing I saw every single morning for the next several years. Some nights in that first apartment I had all to myself, I'd lie there and just look at it. Not out of vanity, out of disbelief mostly, that the girl sleeping in the bushes at Vista View Park had actually made it this far. I left Miami the first real chance I got, and I didn't look back once. 10 years in Boston, climbing one rung at a time, analyst, senior analyst, manager, a director title I'd earned by 32. I built a life up there that had nothing to do with survival mode. An apartment with my name alone on the lease, a closet full of clothes I'd bought myself, at full price because I could. It was in Boston that I reconnected with Dana, a distant cousin of my mother's I'd only met once or twice as a kid. She'd heard I'd moved north and reached out first, and we started meeting for coffee every few months, then talking on the phone just to talk. One evening, a few years into that friendship, I finally asked her the question I'd been carrying since I was 16. "Dana, can I ask you something? Why did Jake hate me so much? I mean, really hate me. I was never a problem for that man." She went quiet for a second, kind of like she had been waiting for me to ask her that question for a long time. "You really don't know?" "I've had 2 years of therapy over not knowing." She sighed. "Your mother wouldn't let him discipline you. Not once. Not ever, from the day they got married. He wanted the belt, the yelling, the whole man of the house routine, and Carol shut it down every single time. Told him flat out, 'You are not her father and you will never touch her.' It was the one thing she never gave him an inch on. Everything else in that marriage, she folded. Money, church, how the house was run. She let him win those, but not that, and he resented it for 10 straight years. I think when she died, he finally didn't have anyone left to stop him." I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. All those years I'd wondered what I'd done. The answer, it turned out, had nothing to do with me at all. It was about a fight I never even knew was being fought on my behalf. One my mother had won every day of her marriage, right up until the day she couldn't fight it anymore. 10 years after I left, my company transferred me back to Miami for a regional director position, more money, more responsibility, and a city I'd sworn I'd never willingly return to. I told myself it didn't matter anymore. I was 33 years old, financially secure, years removed from a park bench. Jake couldn't touch any of that. I was wrong, but not in the way I expected. A few months after I settled back in, a colleague of mine, a woman named Renata who worked in our legal department, mentioned completely by accident that her mother attended a church in Miami Gardens, my old church, Jake's church. When she found out I was from the area, she asked, half joking, if I knew a deacon there named Jake Whitfield. "I know him," I said, careful. "He was my stepfather." Her face changed. Oh, I didn't know that connection. My mom's told me stories about him for years, like church gossip stories. Apparently, he's had this whole reputation for years about how he rescued some troubled teenage stepdaughter from a bad path, put a roof over her head out of the goodness of his heart. My mom always thought it sounded a little too polished, if I'm honest. I felt something cold settle into my chest. "Renata, I need you to tell me everything your mother's ever told you about that story." What came out over the following weeks, piece by piece, was worse than I'd imagined. Jake hadn't just kicked me out and moved on. He'd spent a decade rewriting what happened, turning himself into the hero of a story where I was the cautionary tale, the troubled girl he'd generously taken in, and eventually, sadly, had to let go for her own good and everyone else's safety. He used it, people told me, as a kind of parable in his men's ministry group, a story about tough love, about boundaries, about doing right by a child even when it costs you, and it hadn't stopped at storytelling. Renata's mother mentioned, almost in passing, that Jake had once called a co-worker of his, a woman who sat on the board of a small local scholarship fund I'd applied to during my last year of community college, and quietly suggested I wasn't the kind of candidate they wanted representing that fund. I hadn't gotten that scholarship. I'd always assumed I simply hadn't been competitive enough. I'd been wrong about that too. 3 times now, I understood. Jake had interfered and torpedoed my chances for success. The church families who wouldn't take me in, the manager who fired me over being 3 minutes late, the scholarship that mysteriously slipped away right when I needed it most. Not bad luck, not coincidence. A pattern laid down deliberately by a man determined to make sure I never had an easy inch of ground to stand on, so that if I failed, he'd have been right about me all along. And if I somehow succeeded anyway, at least he'd have made it as hard as he possibly could. I didn't confront Jake privately. I'd thought about it for years, in the abstract, what I'd say to him if I ever got him alone in a room, but privacy was exactly the thing that had protected him for a decade. Privacy was where he did his best work, the quiet phone calls, the casual mentions, the careful cultivation of a reputation nobody thought to question because nobody had reason to. So I didn't give him privacy. I requested to speak during the open testimony portion of a men's ministry event, the very group where Renata's mother said he liked to tell his tough love story. I brought documentation, community college transcripts, a timeline, a letter from the farmer in South Miami, who remembered exactly when I'd shown up on his property at 16 years old with a suitcase and nowhere else to go. I didn't raise my voice once. I didn't have to. I stood in front of a room of people who'd known Jake for years, who'd nodded along to his story more times than they could probably count, and I told them the truth, calmly, the way my mother would have wanted me to. I told them about the week's notice, about Vista View Park, about the McDonald's manager who sat 2 pews over, about the scholarship board he'd called. Nobody in that room said a word while I spoke. When I finished, Jake stood up like he was going to explain himself, and then, for the first time in my entire life, I watched him have absolutely nothing to say. His face had always been so good at composure. That day, it just came apart. I didn't need him punished. I didn't need him arrested, because there was nothing illegal in what he'd done. That had always been the whole point of his careful timing, his 16th birthday math. What I needed and what I got was simpler than that. I needed the truth to exist out loud, in the same rooms where his version of the story had lived unchallenged for 10 years. I got that. Word travels fast in a church that size. He resigned his position as deacon within the month. I heard later that most of his men's ministry group stopped returning his calls. People sometimes ask me if I forgave him. I tell them the truth. I stopped needing him to matter enough to forgive. That's different, and it took me a long time to understand the difference. It's a hard thing, surviving as an orphan at 16. It's a different kind of hard when someone who's supposed to protect you spends the next decade quietly working to make sure you never get back up. There's not much recourse against a man who's careful enough to stay inside the lines while he does it. The law couldn't touch what Jake did to me, but the truth eventually did. If there's anything I'd tell that 16-year-old girl lying in the grass at Vista View Park, looking up at a sky that didn't seem to care, it's this. Arm yourself with everything you can learn, build your own stability brick by brick, and trust that the truth has a longer memory than the people trying to bury it. It took more than 15 years. But it came out. It always does. I think about my mother more now than I did in those early years, when I was too busy surviving to grieve properly. She never got to see any of this. Not the diploma, not the title, not the reckoning. But I don't need her to have seen it to know she'd be proud. She's the one who told me to walk across that stage no matter what happened, and I did. Twice, actually. Everything I have now I built with my own hands, on my own terms, and nobody can ever say I didn't earn every inch of it. Nothing I have was handed to me, not one piece of it. It's mine because I built it, the same way Mom always wanted me to be able to say about my own life, and never quite got the chance to say about hers. That's the part Jake could never touch, and the part my mother would understand best of all. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe.